Welcome to Millennium Counseling Center's podcast, where each week we go in depth into all things mental health, addiction recovery, and being our healthiest and happiest self. Enjoy. This week's episode will be hosted by one of the many incredible therapists here at the Millennium Counseling Center. Please enjoy.
Hey everyone, I'm Lily Weeman and I'm a licensed social worker.
And my name is Amelia Abernathy and I am Millennium Counseling Center's second year clinical intern. So Lily, okay, what was it like for you to find a therapist?
Well, I think finding a therapist can be super daunting and overwhelming. There are a lot of options, a lot of different ways to find therapists. It can just be a little hectic.
What were things that you looked for?
Yeah, I think I sort of took a step back once I was in that hazy place of what am I doing? And I'm like, okay, wait, what do I want? What are my goals? Like on a basic level, I think I wanted to see a woman therapist, probably a little bit older than me, maybe had children of her own, a shared life experience, what that looked like, whether it's like we were athletes, like she was an athlete at one point, or we grew up in similar towns, and then another thing, I think like the practice location. I knew that I wanted it to be convenient for me while I was in grad school, whether I wanted to be in person or virtual, having that component was a big thing. And then again, with the convenience, probably someone that took my insurance. So that's also
kind of
pretty important. But yeah, what about you?
I think I've had 3 different therapists in my life. The second one I had was in undergrad, where I kind of did opposite of you. I didn't want someone convenient. I was in a super small town for undergrad, and I had this irrational fear of showing up at the waiting room and seeing 3 of my sorority sisters. I was so terrified.
Understandable.
Of that. So I looked for someone who was in a surrounding town, and I really looked for someone who was spiritually aware, someone who had been to seminary, which in the South is not that hard to find. But I in college was going through a lot of I've been told my whole life I can't have these mental health problems because I just have to turn them over to God. And I wanted someone to have both and explain these 2 very interfering identities that I felt like I had. And then in post-grad, when I started going to grad school and I moved to Chicago, it was so overwhelming because, when you type things into just Psychology Today in Starkville, Mississippi, 3 people pop up.
Mm-hmm.
And when I got to Chicago, I was like, oh, this is no longer a boutique. This is an IKEA. There's so much here. And I really looked for someone who was young, someone who was a female, someone who had recently gotten licensed, mainly because I found what I wanted to talk about when I moved here was more so the process of becoming a therapist, how daunting grad school can be, how isolating it can be. So I wanted someone who had kind of like you, shared experience. That felt really important. And of course, insurance was super important. But I think the one really great thing about Millennium Counseling Center when people are looking for someone here is we have so many different, diversity, religious expertise, sports. We have recovering alcoholics and addicts. We have people who have experienced these things, and there's a lot to offer. So I feel like we have kind of the Psychology Today. We have a lot to offer. So that's been really great to work here and also see there's so much more to it. I think this side has made me realize different things about being a therapist instead of not necessarily just going to therapy.
Totally. I think something that's standing out for me also when we're having this conversation is recognizing that it's not necessarily going to be a one-size-fits-all type thing. And the process of finding a therapist may have some trial and errors. And I always talk with my clients about sort of checking ourselves with a vibe check. And we're all right, are we sort of meshing well? Our approach or style, how are these conversations going? So I think feedback is really important when you're a therapist, and then also when you're someone who is going to therapy. It doesn't need to be a one-sided conversation when it comes to that topic. Someone who's coming to therapy can be yeah, I liked that one thing, but I'm a little confused on that other thing, and never give me a worksheet ever again. I don't do them. So it can kind of be you also have to let your therapist know what works for you and what doesn't. And then on the other side of that, as a therapist, that's tremendously helpful because we do see a lot of different people. We connect with a lot of different people in a lot of different ways. So there's a lot often going on when we're trying to figure out the best way to sort of sit there and be a witness to that client. So hearing back from our clients what's working and what's not working is super helpful. So it sort of needs to be an open communication in that way.
Yeah. And I think one of the main reasons that might not happen with clients is this like power dynamic thing. And I think as therapist in therapy, you would think I'd be more cognizant of the roles that I play. But I often will find myself in therapy being afraid to be like, I don't want homework, or like this is not working for me. And I'm like, wait, I would want my client to tell me if something wasn't working for them.
Mm-hmm. Funny how that works.
Funny how that, But no, I think that it comes down to like when you get into a therapeutic space, whether that's on Zoom or in an office, it even comes down to like we were talking about earlier, where you sit. Like you're constantly thinking about what is my role here and where are these power dynamics at play? And unfortunately, that can kind of easily flow into progress and conversation that these clients are having. So I think our job as therapists is to invite those conversations to start happening and to say, what's working? What's not? What do you do your homework? Like, if you don't, that's totally fine. Let's find something else
Like,
that's
I'm not going to yell at you,
Yeah.
or I'm not going to be like, all right, I need you to send me proof of doing X, Y, and Z.
Yeah.
It doesn't need to be so like punitive either.
Yes.
It's not.
I think it's taking inventory of ourselves in these spaces and saying, and recognizing the roles that we're playing. And I think that, when you're constantly seeing clients and then you go and transition into being one, even that can kind of mess up your mind and be like, okay, wait, what if I don't really want her to use CBT? Like, what if I would rather we do this or that, And I think we know the language for it. So that often probably plays into the power dynamics too.
Mm-hmm. I think something that has sort of helped my own journey to figuring out what kind of therapist I want to be, or being comfortable with what even calling myself a therapist. I know we spoke about imposter syndrome on last week's episode or a previous episode. And I think something that's really helped me is this whole feedback thing. Like, I don't have all the answers, and I am never going to tell anyone that I have all the answers. There is never going to be a moment when I'm like, I know exactly what's best for this person. I'm always going to check in with the person across from me, whether in person, on Zoom, about, again, just asking. I think opening the dialogue, I think, is the best thing that we can do as therapists, and letting them know that feedback is so important. Because again, that power thing, like sometimes, like, I don't know, when I go get my hair done or get my nails done,
I never
I'm
tell them.
not telling them
Even
how
if
to
it
do their
looks
job.
tragic. I'm like, oh, it is gorgeous. Thank you so much.
So again, I mean, and it's silly, we're laughing, but like it's a very similar thing. When someone comes into our office, they're like, oh, they're here because they have these credentials, or they went to this school, or they went all the things that we need to do to be here, which I do think is important and valid and very needed. But there's this part of them like, oh, well, maybe they're giving me this because like they think I'm this, but like, am I allowed to tell them? Like kind of freaking out.
Yeah. And then you think about the process that it took for them to get into the office. I mean, we were just talking about you get on Psychology Today, Google, referrals from friends. There's this whole world that's opened up when you finally even say to yourself, maybe I should go to therapy, which in of itself is terrifying. And then here you are sitting in this office and maybe it's been 3 or 4 sessions and you're like, this isn't working, but I did all of that work to get here. Like, I guess I just kind of have to grin and bear it. And you don't. You can say, this isn't working. And whether that means switching up styles inside, the therapeutic space, or maybe it means finding a different therapist and going through that journey again, which is daunting. But I think when you have a therapist who will support your decision making and applaud you for voicing that, it makes the journey a lot less scary.
I completely agree. So I do think there's an importance of sometimes taking a back seat and like reassessing and just like pulling back away, because oftentimes goals change, needs change. I mean, you're constantly changing, so your relationship is always changing with your therapist, whether it's, oh, I think we're getting a little bit too comfortable with each other, or I'm walking into therapy 5 minutes late, like, whoops, sorry, like there's a boundary. Like with that power dynamic comes still this boundary of this is my job and I'm trained to be here and this is my time, this is your time. Both of our time, money, energy, whatever is all sort of, I don't want to use at stake, but like it's alive and well in the room. You know what I mean? So there's an aspect of taking time to like step back and reassess and really ask yourself as the client and as the therapist, are we getting too comfortable? Do I need to switch things up? Whatever it may be.
I also think too, facilitating those conversations and as a therapist voicing like, hey, I'm so proud of you for bringing this up and the fact that you might be too comfortable, and kind of illustrating what a healthy boundary and communicative conversation can look like, can then allow that person to go into their relationships, whether it's family, friends, partners, bosses, like whomever it might be. They then know, oh, I can have these conversations and I know what it looks like to positively say, I need different. I need different. Just, I need something different working in my life for the way that I work, operate, or feel.
Totally. I mean, I think for some therapists and for some clients, that's really the end goal, is like mimicking the relationship within your therapeutic relationship, that you can then step outside of the space and sort of show up like that in your everyday life.
Yeah, I agree.